Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our third presentation with Faizan Malik, titled COVID-19, Necropolitics, and Marginalized Experiences During a Global Pandemic. Faizan is pursuing a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science at the University of Toronto. Just a friendly reminder before we begin to leave all comments and questions in the comment box on Teachable and or on YouTube. And we'll be posing your questions to the panel during the live Q&A following our last presentation. Thank you. The floor is all yours, Faizan.
This presentation is called COVID-19 Necropolitics and Marginalized Experiences. So specifically what I'm focusing on is a contrast between a necropolitical kind of structuring of the response to the pandemic and one that's based on a specific kind of scientific narrative. So just to give a kind of brief outline of what I mean by necropolitical, so there's a kind of shift from the Foucauldian notion of biopolitical power, which is power over life, to Achille Mbembe's notion of the necropolitical, which is specifically, as opposed simply to the ability to govern who is fit for living in the Foucauldian sense, but also who is fit for dying. So specific policies that states can undertake to expose certain populations to death or expose certain populations to certain forms of violence. So again, there's a contrast that I want to create between the notion of a kind of scientific response to the pandemic, which I think is perhaps not the best way to go about it, any kind of critical or necropolitical response. And that's because science is functioning now, it seems, as the new basis of a kind of technocratic legitimacy, which is that since most responses to COVID-19 are being structured under the guise of like, listen to the science, this is what you see in the media and the kind of, public sphere. The danger here is not that the science is false or inaccurate. Rather, the problem is that the science is almost too correct, it's too accurate in some sense, and it can be used effectively as a form of technocratic legitimacy. So for example, Boris Johnson here, he had one of the kind of earliest ideas that we should build herd immunity in the UK, that when a majority of people in the country get COVID-19, will build kind of generalized resiliency. And even though there was a kind of backlash in the media, the scientific community did come out to say that, well, there is some kind of general credence to this idea. But I think that's where the problem lies, that essentially, if this herd immunity had been implemented through a form of scientific rationality, what would have happened is that the amount of people that are necessary to die in the herd immunity kind of rationale would have been people without access to healthcare, people without access to social services, people just generally in the lower income strata of society. And obviously, this would have been disproportionately people in marginalized groups. So there's a way in which science cannot provide the answer for very legitimate social crises that take place, in the sense that if we do implement some sort of scientific rationale, how is this actually going to affect the process of marginalized experiences? Are they actually going to somehow come out worse off? And this is what I mean by conflicting narratives of technocratic legitimacy. So at the same time that in the United States, for example, we have massive riots for Black Lives Matter, massive riots for racial justice and equality, we see rationalizations from the kind of technocratic state that, this person was reaching for a gun, or, they have past crime histories, et cetera, et cetera. A variety of excuses are made that we just can't accept in terms of why this kind of violence is being enacted. And yet what happened in COVID-19, strangely enough, is that this idea of scientific legitimacy, scientific expertise, has actually been used to recreate a sense of technocratic legitimacy in the state. That the same state we had just undermined as a kind of, arbiter of police violence, for example, we now have to rely on that same exact state as a kind of, bureaucratic expert in terms of what the science is, how we're going to be implementing the science. So again, the point isn't that we shouldn't be listening to scientific measures. Absolutely, we should be. But rather, the point is, should we structure our response primarily as scientific? Or, we should be more critical of how scientific responses can often bolster technocratic legitimacy for otherwise failed institutions. And there's also variation here across states where you don't even necessarily need to have a national kind of scientific program. So for example, in Brazil, unlike the UK, necropolitical administration takes the form of a non-scientific rationale, where Bolsonaro is saying that, I reject the science entirely, masks are not mandatory, no one needs to, you can medicate with bleach and things of this fashion. And so we see the very real reality of explicit state power instead, and how science is completely ineffective in countering this. So for example, indigenous Brazilians live on the specific form of kind of indigenous territories. Now, whether they follow the science or not, whether they're washing their hands, whether they're using hand sanitizer, this is not going to change the reality of state power, which is that Bolsonaro is already further encroaching on their land. He's kind of funding development projects into the Brazilian Amazon. So common to both cases, both in the UK and Brazil, scientific rationale, non-scientific rationale, is that following the science only works as an effective strategy for specific members of the population dictated through necropolitical administration. So if you're one of the populations that can be kind of effectively exposed to death by state policies, such as marginalized communities, such as indigenous communities in Brazil, you are not actually going to be able to use science as a structuring kind of narrative to protect yourself. And ironically, kind of subsidiary ideology of science can also be used. So for example, Bolsonaro openly rejects scientific expertise, but then he uses a form of scientific racism to justify policies that harm indigenous communities. He says things like, oh, they're unhygienic, they're evolutionarily underdeveloped. So he's not willing to not use science. He's only willing to use science in a way to kind of harm indigenous communities through kind of specific violent language. Science is also a depoliticizing mechanism. That's why I put this fellow here from the World Health Organization. He said, don't politicize COVID-19. But really, the flexibility to not politicize COVID-19 is, again, it's a function of the political. So some of the earliest Brazilian cases of COVID-19 occurred when wealthy families that were vacationing Paris, Milan, they came home, they went to their domestic care workers. They didn't notify them that, hey, I'm actually sick. I've tested positive for COVID-19 in some case. They didn't even tell them. And these domestic care workers actually ended up dying. So in that sense, even two people who are following the science equivalently, let's say they're both doing everything they need to do, hand sanitizer, washing their hands, wearing masks, we can see how they can actually, or their death is differentiated by the fact that who has access to medical care, who has access to social services, who has employment flexibility. So many marginalized communities don't have the flexibility to view COVID-19 as non-political. Specifically in Brazil, for example, in the favelas, like certain gangs essentially have to be the ones that are administering kind of, hand sanitizer and social services because the state is not willing to do so. So they don't have the flexibility to view COVID-19 as non-political. For them, it's entirely political. It's a question of class, gender, race, etc., etc. And equally, what COVID-19 is creating here is a form of specific technocratic governmentality. So the specific implementation of scientific measures, it bolsters obviously the ability of states, as we discussed, to engage in necropolitical administration. But it equally creates new manifestations of kind of state power, which individualizes moral responsibility. So you have to be essentially consensually and voluntarily responsible for doing things like, wearing a mask, washing your hands, hand sanitizer, especially in Western states, which were kind of more lax in terms of their early COVID policy, in terms of making these things mandatory. So in that sense, we create a kind of moral culture in terms of who's following regulations and who's not following regulations. So populations who are unable to uphold these measures, such as homeless people, for example, they're now forced to kind of consensually agree to certain state measures, such as being forced into squatter camps, tightly packed warehouses. And obviously, it's not really consensual in the sense that if they're not going to agree to this, they'll be part of that moral scapegoat. They'll be part of that new culture of governmentality, which is that if you're not upholding these different things, like, washing your hands, all these different state kind of procedures that you have to uphold, you can be kind of the victim of a form of righteous violence. So for example, we noticed in Toronto specifically, where Doug Ford, he has been kind of he's been increasing the privatization of long-term care homes. And then anytime if you try to kind of criticize this medical administration or a larger kind of economic context, for example, you'll be kind of responded to with the idea that, well, people are not following the science, people are not washing their hands, et cetera, et cetera. So science actually becomes a depoliticizing force, and it becomes the structure of a new technocratic governmentality, which some populations entirely are not able to engage in. For example, homeless populations. Recently, I saw on the news a very upsetting story about a woman who had a specific mental illness. She was not able to engage in these kind of COVID procedures to the same extent. Things like, washing your hands, wearing masks, she was not able to do them to the same extent. And so by creating these moral cultures of governmentality in which if you're not kind of upholding, often voluntarily and consensually, these obligations, then you can be the victim of a kind of, backlash by the state, even a backlash by citizens. And so again, these are all being legitimated by the science. The science is creating a kind of individualization of COVID-19. Next, the state of exception going forward. So Agamben bases his idea of the state of exception on a kind of particular reading of Carl Schmitt's critique of political economy, even one could say. So for him, liberal politics tries to, and by liberal, he means kind of parliamentary democratic politics. And he's writing in 1930s at the end, to be fair, he was a member of the Nazi party, which is obviously why he would say something like this and criticize liberal politics. But his essential point was that liberal politics assumes the death of the sovereign, that the sovereign power, like the traditional monarch has completely died. They no longer exist. Now we have parliament, we have rule of law, etc., etc. But Membe and Agamben both recreate the sense of sovereignty with Carl Schmitt's notion of the state of exception, which is that anytime the sovereign wants, they can actually just completely disregard every single rule that exists, parliamentary democracy, all of these things can be completely removed. And the state is still the sovereign. So for example, 9/11. In 9/11, after 9/11, the privacy kind of massive surveillance state came into place, massive invasion of privacy, the creation of the TSA. And these are things that were supposed to exist for a limited period of time. They were supposed to exist as a kind of state of exception that, okay, there's a problem of terrorism, we're implementing these new policies. Now it's been 20 years, and it doesn't seem that this state of exception is ever going to end. So even though we had supposed kind of freedoms of privacy and freedom of thought and association, the sovereign, the state, is able to implement a kind of arbitrary state of exception and just say, no, due to some, emergency, state of emergency, now we have to forego all these rights. No longer any right to privacy, no longer any right to freedom of association. We're going to be monitoring your phone calls, etc., etc. So that's the best example. But crucial here is that this form of historical sovereignty is much different than today's contemporary sovereignty, obviously, because in historical sovereignty, as Foucault mentions, any form of death would have to be justified by reference to the sovereign. That if you killed someone, it would have to be that, oh, I killed them for the king or the queen. Today, if you kill someone, death has to be kind of justified in regards to the larger social body. And what COVID-19 is doing is providing specific opportunities for a state of exception, a necropolitical administration that is going to be using features of COVID-19 regulation and risk as a cover for a kind of indefinite policy. So for example, again, Brazil, Bolsonaro has prevented indigenous Brazilians from accessing medical care outside of indigenous territories. And he's citing medical concerns. He's saying that, they have diseases, they're being unhygienic, et cetera, et cetera. A variety of justifications and rationalizations are being made. But what really is taking place here is the state of exception that hypothetically never has to end. Because at what point would these policies be removed, essentially? Let's say that, 2 years from now, COVID-19 is gone. It'll still be difficult to get vaccines to the indigenous population in Brazil. Even if we got them vaccines, justifications could be made that, okay, well, now we understand how dangerous global pandemics can be. So going forward, we have a new set of policies to prevent certain populations from being able to be kind of, harbingers of disease during a kind of pandemic. So obviously you can notice the kind of, certain racial, ethnic, class-based undertones in terms of how these policies are going to be created and implemented. And this is what I mean by state of exception, that what the state can do is create a series of necropolitical administrative policies, which using the state of emergency and the idea of the pandemic, the idea of, COVID-19 going on forever, they can use these to indefinitely kind of pursue these policies for as long as they want. Similar to the 9/11 kind of breaches of privacy, which we still see continuing today. I don't think it's kind of outside of the imagination that even 20 years from now we can have specific kind of pandemic centric policies that to prevent another global pandemic, such and such populations need to be restricted in some fashion. And obviously this kind of implies another sense of state violence and kind of state coercion in that sense. So yes, in terms of concluding thoughts, it's not the purpose of this presentation to say that COVID-19 regulation is necessarily wrong or that following the scientific procedures is wrong. These scientific procedures, obviously they exist for a reason, they help people, but our primary response to COVID-19 should not be based on this notion of science because, science can serve as a basis for technocratic legitimation where even though we've successfully kind of, had a massive protest movement, now we're actually restructuring the legitimation of the state. We're restructuring technocracy. We're restructuring kind of, bureaucratic experts. It can bolster necropolitical administration, and it most importantly depoliticizes the social, political, and economic realities of the COVID-19 pandemic because COVID-19 is not a scientific problem. As much as it is a social problem, for example. And that's why in countries like the United States, when you see responses saying, oh, we need to wear masks, we need to wash our hands from people like, Biden, for example, right? Obviously, Trump was saying things almost akin to don't wear a mask, but the response has not been much better. This kind of, science-friendly approach that the Biden administration is taking that we need to, focus on science because that's not focusing on the medical administration. It's not focusing on why certain groups are more likely to, be infected with COVID-19, often based on racial, class, gender lines. So again, these entire social realities are obscured by looking at this kind of scientific absolutism. It's depoliticizing and it reconstructs legitimacies for the state. So instead, we should maintain a kind of critical acceptance, sure, of scientific procedures, but as one of the many narratives that we're using to address the consequences of COVID-19 going forward. And we should also continue to be critical of the ways that these narratives of scientific legitimacy supremacy affect us as citizens, subjects, and communities, especially in areas in the global south in which necropolitical administration could continue for the foreseeable future, specifically against indigenous groups and vulnerable populations in that fashion. So that was the presentation. Thank you guys so much for listening, and that was the end of it.
Thank you, Faizan.